The rain pelted against the windows of the Thompson household, creating a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the otherwise silent home. It was the kind of night where the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the warm, comforting glow of the living room lights and the promise of a quiet evening. But for Sarah Thompson, the peace of that night was an illusion. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sarah had always thought of her life as a picture-perfect example of suburban bliss. Married to David, a successful real estate agent, she had everything she could ever want. A beautiful home, a loving husband, and a wonderful daughter, Emma, from her previous marriage. To the outside world, they were the epitome of a happy family. Friends and neighbors would often comment on how lucky she was to have found such a devoted husband after the difficulties of her first marriage. They were the kind of family that people envied, but little did they know that behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. David was the kind of man who could charm anyone. With his easy smile and confident demeanor, he was well liked by everyone who knew him. He had a way of making people feel at ease, and it wasn't long before he became a pillar of the community. He was active in local charities, attended all of Emma's school events, and was always the first to lend a hand to a neighbor in need. To most, he was the ideal husband and father. But there were moments when Sarah noticed something off. At first, it was just little things, a lingering look between David and Emma that seemed too intimate, a comment that felt out of place, or the way he would sometimes brush a strand of hair away from Emma's face with a tenderness that made Sarah uncomfortable. She tried to push these thoughts aside, convincing herself that she was being paranoid. After all, David had never given her any reason to doubt him. But as the days went by, her unease grew. The doubts began to creep in slowly, like a dark cloud on the horizon. Sarah started to notice more peculiarities in David's behavior. He began working late more often, claiming that he had to meet clients or attend networking events. Yet when she tried to call him during these times, he rarely answered his phone. When he did, his explanations were vague, and his tone was distant. Sarah told herself that it was just the stress of work, that he was under pressure to close deals and provide for their family. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Then there was Emma. Sarah adored her daughter and had always been close to her, but lately Emma had become more withdrawn. She spent more time in her room, often with the door closed, and when Sarah would ask her about her day, Emma's responses were short and evasive. There were times when Sarah caught Emma staring off into the distance, a troubled expression on her face as if she was carrying a burden too heavy for her young shoulders. When Sarah pressed her for details, Emma would simply shake her head and say everything was fine. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She knew her daughter too well to believe that everything was okay. Unbeknownst to Sarah, David and Emma had been hiding a secret that would destroy everything Sarah held dear. What had started as innocent conversations had slowly evolved into something much darker. David, in his twisted mind, had convinced himself that he was in love with Emma. He had always been drawn to her, but over time, his feelings had grown into an obsession. He began to see her not as his stepdaughter, but as a woman, someone he could possess. And Emma, young and impressionable, had been manipulated into believing she felt the same. David's attention made her feel special, important, in a way that she had never experienced before. He showered her with compliments, told her she was beautiful, and made her feel like the center of his world. But his affection was a poison, slowly seeping into Emma's mind, warping her sense of right and wrong. They took great pains to keep their affair hidden. Late-night text messages, secret rendezvous when Sarah was out, and lies upon lies to cover their tracks. They would meet in secluded spots, away from prying eyes, where they could be alone together. David was careful, always making sure that they weren't seen, that no one would suspect what was really going on. But no secret can stay hidden forever. Sarah's suspicions began to solidify one evening when she came home early from a business trip. She had planned to surprise David and Emma, excited to spend the weekend with her family. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed that the house was dark, except for a faint light coming from Emma's room. A sense of unease washed over her as she quietly let herself in. The house was eerily silent, and as she made her way upstairs, she could hear hushed voices coming from behind Emma's closed door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. What she saw when she opened the door would haunt her forever. David and Emma were sitting on the bed, too close, their hands intertwined. The look of shock on their faces when they saw Sarah said it all. They scrambled to explain it away, but the truth was glaringly obvious. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the walls closing in as Sarah's world came crashing down. She felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. How could this be happening? How could the man she loved betray her in such a horrific way? That night, the Thompson household erupted in chaos. Sarah demanded answers, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. She couldn't understand how David, the man she had trusted with her life, could do something so monstrous. David tried to calm her down, tried to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, but his words only fueled her rage. How could he lie to her like this? How could he do this to their family? Emma, caught in the middle, broke down in tears, realizing the full extent of what she had done. She had been led astray, manipulated by someone she thought she could trust, and now everything was falling apart. The argument that followed was the culmination of months of deceit and manipulation. Sarah's anger reached a boiling point, and in the heat of the moment, David lost control. His calm, charming facade cracked, revealing the darkness that had been lurking underneath. He began to shout, his voice filled with desperation and anger. He accused Sarah of never understanding him, of always being too focused on her own needs to see what he was going through. The situation spiraled out of control, and before anyone could comprehend what was happening, tragedy struck. In a fit of blind rage, David grabbed a heavy object, a trophy from his office desk, and struck Sarah. The blow was fatal. Sarah collapsed to the floor, her life slipping away before Emma's horrified eyes. David stood over her, breathing heavily, as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. But it was too late. The damage was done. Emma, frozen in shock, couldn't move. The man she thought she loved had just murdered her mother. The dreamlike state she had been living in was shattered, leaving her trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The police arrived within minutes, alerted by a frantic call from Emma. David was arrested without resistance, his once confident demeanor replaced by a blank, hollow stare. The community was stunned. How could this happen in their peaceful neighborhood? The news spread like wildfire, with reporters swarming the Thompson home, trying to piece together the details of the horrific crime. Neighbors who had once admired David now looked at him with a mixture of fear and disgust. The perfect image he had cultivated was destroyed, replaced by the reality of his monstrous actions. At the trial, the full extent of David's manipulation of Emma was revealed. The jury listened in shock as the twisted relationship between the stepfather and stepdaughter was laid bare. David showed no remorse, his face expressionless as the guilty verdict was read. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emma, who had been forced to testify against him, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The weight of her involvement in the crime, however manipulated she had been, was something she would carry with her forever. As the years passed, the memory of the crime faded from the headlines. But for those who knew the Thompsons, the scars remained. Emma, now a young woman, struggled to rebuild her life, haunted by the memory of that fateful night. She moved away from the town where the tragedy had occurred, hoping to escape the whispers and judgment of those who knew her. But no matter where she went, the past followed her. She found it difficult to trust anyone, always afraid that they would see her as damaged, tainted by the horrors she had lived through. The house that once stood as a symbol of a happy family was eventually sold, but the dark history lingered, a reminder of the evil that can lurk behind closed doors. New families came and went, each unaware of the tragedy that had taken place within its walls. But for those who remembered, the house would always be a place of darkness, a monument to the twisted lies and shattered lives left in the wake of David Thompson's descent into madness. Emma eventually sought therapy, trying to make sense of the trauma she had endured. It was a long, painful journey, filled with setbacks and moments of despair. But slowly, she began to heal. She learned to forgive herself, to understand that she had been a victim of manipulation, not a willing participant in her mother's death. With time, she found a sense of peace, though the memories of that night would never fully leave her. The story of the Thompsons serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk in even the most seemingly perfect families. It is a tale of deceit, manipulation, and ultimately, the devastating consequences of unchecked desires. In the end, It is a story of loss, the loss of innocence, the loss of trust, and the loss of a life that was taken too soon. And for Emma, it is a story of survival, a testament to the strength it takes to move forward in the face of unimaginable pain. The next story is stepfather's secret affair with stepson leads to brutal murder in the quiet town of Oakwood, nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont. The Parker family seemed like the perfect embodiment of the American dream. James Parker, a successful architect in his early 52s, was a respected member of the community. He was the proud patriarch of a blended family, married to the warm and charismatic Elizabeth, a woman who had brought light back into his life after the death of his first wife. Together they had crafted an idyllic life, raising Elizabeth's teenage son, Ryan, from her previous marriage, alongside James's own daughter, Emily. But beneath the facade of domestic bliss, James harbored a secret so dark and twisted that even those closest to him would have never suspected. A secret that, once revealed, would tear the Parker family apart and lead to a shocking and grisly crime that would leave the small town of Oakwood reeling in disbelief. It all began innocently enough, or so it seemed. As Ryan, now 19, began to mature, James found himself inexplicably drawn to the young man who had grown up under his roof. What started as a seemingly paternal bond gradually morphed into something far more sinister. James, a man torn between his responsibilities and forbidden desires, embarked on a dangerous path that blurred the lines between fatherly love and something far more inappropriate. Ryan, unaware of the brewing storm, began to sense the subtle changes in James's behavior. At first it was the lingering glances, the unnecessary touches, the private conversations that seemed to carry an unspoken tension. But as the months passed, the bond between stepfather and stepson became increasingly complex, filled with confusion, manipulation, and ultimately, betrayal. The turning point came one fateful night when Elizabeth was out of town for a business trip. The atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken emotions as James and Ryan found themselves alone. A simple conversation took a dark and unexpected turn, spiraling into a confession of feelings that should have never been spoken. Shocked and repulsed, Ryan tried to distance himself, but James's obsession had already crossed a dangerous line. As the days passed, the tension in the Parker household became unbearable. Elizabeth, sensing something amiss but unable to pinpoint the source, grew increasingly anxious. Ryan, tormented by guilt and fear, became withdrawn and moody, avoiding James at every turn. And James, driven by his forbidden desires, began to unravel, his behavior growing more erratic and desperate. Then, one evening, the fragile balance of their lives was shattered. Ryan, unable to bear the weight of the secret any longer, confided in a close friend about his stepfather's advances. But the truth had a way of finding its way back to James, and when it did, the consequences were deadly. Fueled by rage and humiliation, James confronted Ryan in a fit of uncontrollable fury. The argument quickly escalated into violence, and in the heat of the moment, James committed an act so brutal that it would forever stain the Parker family name. When the authorities arrived, the scene they discovered was nothing short of a nightmare. Ryan's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood, and James, once a pillar of the community, sat in shock, his hands stained with the evidence of his crime. As the investigation unfolded, the town of Oakwood was rocked by the revelations that emerged. James's double life, his forbidden desires, and the deadly obsession that had consumed him became the subject of public scrutiny and media frenzy. The once respected architect was now a pariah, his reputation destroyed, and his family left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by a secret that should have never been kept. The story of James Parker and Ryan was not just a tale of forbidden love, it was a cautionary tale of how hidden desires, when left unchecked, can lead to devastating consequences. The tragedy that befell the Parker family serves as a grim reminder that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and when they are finally exposed, the cost can be far greater than anyone could have imagined. In the idyllic suburb of Brooksville, where perfectly manicured lawns and friendly waves were the norm, no one would have ever suspected the dark secrets brewing behind closed doors. Karen Whitman, a devoted wife and mother of two, seemed to have it all: a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a reputation as the heart of the community. Yet beneath the polished veneer of her life lay a void, a creeping loneliness that grew more profound with each passing year. Karen's husband, John, a successful businessman, had become increasingly distant, his mind always on his work. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, had dwindled into a series of mundane exchanges about bills and the children's schedules. The passion that had once defined their relationship had faded, replaced by a cold routine. Karen felt invisible, trapped in a life that no longer resembled the one she had envisioned when she walked down the aisle years ago. Enter Mark, the handsome and charismatic son of their new neighbors. Fresh out of college and full of youthful exuberance, Mark was everything that Karen's life lacked: exciting, carefree, and, most importantly, attentive. He noticed Karen in a way that no one else did, complimenting her on things her husband had long taken for granted. Their interactions started innocently enough: chats over the fence while gardening, a shared cup of coffee when Mark would drop by to help with small chores. But soon, these moments became the highlight of Karen's day, and the boundaries of propriety began to blur. As summer stretched on, their encounters grew more frequent, each one more intimate than the last. What began as harmless flirtation escalated into secret rendezvous, passionate embraces, and whispered promises. Karen, once a model of suburban virtue, found herself consumed by a forbidden affair with a man nearly half her age. Mark, equally enthralled by the allure of the forbidden, became obsessed with Karen, seeing her not just as a lover, but as the key to an exciting and unconventional life. But in a town as small as Brooksville, secrets have a way of surfacing. Mark's mother, Evelyn, began to notice the changes in her son: his constant disappearances, his sudden mood swings, and the way his eyes lingered on Karen whenever she was near. She tried to dismiss it as a harmless crush, but the truth was too glaring to ignore. Meanwhile, Karen's husband, John, who had long been too engrossed in his work to notice the emotional distance growing between him and his wife, stumbled upon the truth in the most unexpected way: a cryptic text message from Mark, left open on Karen's phone. John's world shattered in an instant. The betrayal cut deep, and the anger that surged within him was overwhelming. He confronted Karen, demanding to know the truth. The confrontation was explosive, a collision of years of pent-up resentment, guilt, and unfulfilled desires. Karen, caught in her lies, confessed to the affair, but it was too late to salvage anything. The damage was done, and the life they had built together was irreparably fractured. The affair could have ended there, a scandalous tale of suburban infidelity, destined to be the talk of the town for months. But the situation took a darker turn when Mark, unable to cope with the sudden end of the affair and the emotional fallout, became increasingly unstable. Consumed by jealousy and obsession, Mark started to stalk Karen, refusing to let go of what they had shared. He believed they were meant to be together, and if he couldn't have her, no one could. One fateful night, as a storm raged outside, Mark broke into the Whitman home, armed and desperate. He confronted Karen in the kitchen, his eyes wild with a mixture of love and hatred. What followed was a violent struggle that left Karen fighting for her life. The sounds of the altercation woke John, who rushed downstairs to find his wife being attacked by the very man who had destroyed their marriage. In a desperate attempt to save Karen, John intervened, and in the chaos, Mark's obsession reached its tragic conclusion. When the police arrived, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Mark lay dead, his life ended by the same hands that had once embraced him with love. Karen, bruised and broken, was left to grapple with the consequences of her choices that had led to a nightmarish end she could never have foreseen. In the aftermath, the quiet town of Brooksville was forever changed. The Whitman home, once a symbol of stability and success, became a chilling reminder of how quickly life can spiral out of control. The affair, the obsession, and the murder became the stuff of local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones for years to come. Karen, now alone, was left to pick up the pieces of a life torn apart by a moment of weakness, a fleeting desire that led to unthinkable tragedy. Rebecca Mitchell had always been the perfect wife, or so everyone in Saintsville believed. Her life was a seamless blend of routine and devotion. A loving mother to her 2 children, a supportive wife to her husband Daniel, and a devout member of St. Mary's Catholic Church. To the outside world, she was a model of virtue, an embodiment of the small town's values. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, Rebecca's life was anything but perfect. It all began with a chance encounter, or at least that's what Rebecca told herself. Father Michael had been new to the parish, fresh out of seminary and full of fervor for his calling. His sermons were a breath of fresh air to the congregation, his words resonating deeply with those who listened. But to Rebecca, there was something more, a subtle connection, an unspoken understanding that drew her to him like a moth to a flame. Their first real conversation had been after a Sunday Mass. Rebecca had lingered after the service, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming charity event. But the truth was, she wanted to be near him, to bask in the warmth of his presence. There was something about Father Michael, a depth to his eyes, a sadness that spoke of struggles he had yet to reveal. Rebecca, too, carried her own burdens, though she hid them well behind her smile and gentle demeanor. As the weeks passed, their interactions became more frequent. Rebecca found herself volunteering for every church activity just to have an excuse to see him. They began meeting in the rectory, first to discuss church matters, then gradually their conversations drifted to more personal topics. Father Michael spoke of his calling, his struggles with faith, and the loneliness that sometimes crept into his heart. Rebecca, in turn, shared the secrets she had kept hidden for so long, the strain in her marriage, the emptiness she felt despite her seemingly perfect life. It was during one of these late-night conversations that the first crack appeared in their carefully maintained facades. Rebecca had been crying, the weight of her unspoken sorrows too much to bear. Father Michael reached out to comfort her, his hand brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they both knew that they had crossed a line. But it was a line they were both eager to cross again. What began as fleeting touches soon escalated into stolen kisses, secret rendezvous in the quiet corners of the church. They told themselves it was harmless, that they could stop at any time. But with each encounter, the pull between them grew stronger, the guilt and the thrill intertwining in a tangled web of desire and shame. Rebecca's life became a precarious balancing act. She continued to play the role of the perfect wife and mother, but inside she was torn apart by the duality of her existence. Daniel, ever the dutiful husband, was oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. But the cracks were beginning to show. He noticed her absences, the way she seemed distracted, distant, but he was too preoccupied with his work to dig deeper, too trusting to believe that his wife could ever betray him. Then came the day that changed everything. Rebecca had planned to meet Father Michael in the church after dark, under the guise of preparing for the upcoming Easter service. It was supposed to be just another of their secret meetings, a brief respite from the guilt that was slowly consuming her. But as she entered the church, she felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. Father Michael was already there, pacing nervously by the altar. The tension in the air was palpable as she approached him. They had spoken earlier that day, and he had seemed troubled, distant. Now, as she stood before him, she could see the turmoil in his eyes. "Rebecca," he began, his voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this. It's tearing me apart." His words hit her like a blow. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it with every fiber of her being. But hearing it out loud, seeing the pain in his eyes, was more than she could bear. Before she could respond, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen, but I can't keep lying to myself, to God." Rebecca's heart raced as his words sank in. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that the guilt was eating her alive. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a desperate, passionate kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they couldn't say, of love, of fear, of the knowledge that this was the end. But as they kissed, a shadow moved in the corner of the church. Rebecca pulled away, her heart pounding in her chest. It was then that she saw him, Daniel, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fury. The look in his eyes was one she had never seen before, a mixture of betrayal and something darker, something that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Then, without a word, Daniel turned and walked out of the church, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. Rebecca's world came crashing down around her. The life she had so carefully built, the secrets she had fought to keep hidden, were all laid bare. She wanted to run after him, to beg for his forgiveness, but her legs wouldn't move. All she could do was watch as the man she had once loved disappeared into the night, taking with him the last remnants of her old life. In the days that followed, the whispers in Saintsville grew louder. The townspeople, always quick to judge, had plenty to say about the scandal that had rocked their quiet community. Rebecca became the subject of their gossip, her reputation torn to shreds by the very people she had once called friends. Daniel, too, was not spared. The once proud, hard-working man was now a shell of his former self, haunted by the betrayal of the woman he had loved. As for Father Michael, he was removed from the parish, sent away to a distant monastery to atone for his sins. Rebecca never saw him again, though she often thought of him, wondering if he too was tormented by the memories of what they had shared. But even as her life fell apart, Rebecca couldn't escape the feeling that there was more to come. The sense of foreboding that had first gripped her in the church had never left, and as the days turned into weeks, it only grew stronger. Something was coming, something dark and terrible that would make everything that had happened so far seem like a mere prelude. And then, one stormy night, it arrived.